Do spell builds deal more damage than nail builds? Let's find out. There are 3 different spells in Hollow Knight, each with their own damage and animation times. It's easy enough to figure out how much an individual spell deals, but I want to find out how much consistent damage a spell build can deal if played to perfection. This includes not only the spells themselves, but also the nail strikes needed to generate the soul required to keep feeding our casts. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, let's introduce the spells themselves. Obviously, we are going to be using the upgraded version of spells from the get-go for maximum damage output. The first spell we're looking at is Shade Soul. This spell fires a single large projectile forward that deals 30 damage, with a cast time of 0.415 seconds and a burst DPS of 72.29. Alternatively, if we use Fluke Nest and land every fluke projectile, it'll be dealing 64 damage over the same time for a burst DPS of 154.22. Next up is Descending Dark. This spell causes the knight to dash downwards, creating a large explosion upon impacting the ground, and granting the knight brief damage immunity. This spell is made up of multiple hits, including damage from the direct impact, the explosion, and then the shockwave. If all 3 parts hit, it'll deal 65 damage and take a minimum of 1 second for a DPS of 65. And finally, we have Abyss Shriek. This is the highest damage spell of the 3, but arguably one of the hardest to hit. This spell creates an explosion above the knight, dealing 80 damage and taking 0.6 seconds to cast for a burst of 133.33 DPS. And if all we're doing is spamming spells back to back, these figures should give us a good idea of how much damage we're dealing per second. But of course, to cast these spells in the first place, we'll need to get soul somehow, be it through nail strikes or the dream nail. So how much DPS are we dealing if we take this into account? So I got to work on a spreadsheet to figure out just that. We can swing our nail once every 0.41 seconds, which will deal 21 damage and generate 11 soul. All spells cost 33 soul, meaning 3 nail strikes for every cast. One other thing to take into consideration is we can animation cancel our nail strikes with a spell, shortening the duration to 0.11 seconds from 0.41 seconds if a cast precedes it. With all these figures in mind, I inputted them into my spreadsheet and started us off with 0 soul in the gauge. I then simulated each attack's damage, duration, and how much soul it left us with, and kept going until I got back to 0 soul, which would signal a complete loop to ensure the amount of casts and strikes was as accurate as possible. And this is how it played out. We do our first strike taking 0.41 seconds and giving us 11 soul, and then our second strike happens, taking the same time and getting us to 22 soul. Finally, our third strike starts. However, since we have 33 soul the instant we start the attack, enough to cast, we can animation cancel the swing down to 0.11 seconds and cast our first spell, taking another 0.415 seconds for a Shade Soul. And then we start it all over again. With Shade Soul, this works out to 69.14 DPS. Plugging in the other spells, we can see the results from them as well. Fluke Nest hits for 94.42 DPS, Descending Dark hits for 66.32 DPS, and Abyss Shriek hits for 93.46 DPS. Not only is Descending Dark the lowest damage dealer of the 4 spells, but it's also so awkward to land while weaving nail hits that I'm going to be ignoring it from here on out, unless something interesting about it pops up. Now, in a real fight, it's probably more efficient to unload your spells all at once when the opportunity shows itself. However, on paper at least, we're casting the moment we have enough soul to get more animation cancels on our nail. These animation cancels are actually a huge DPS boost, spiking to 190.9 DPS each time we do one. This also means we never get to the point of filling our reserve soul vessels, which benefits us, as we get reduced soul per hit once the main vessel is full. These numbers provide a good baseline, but we can't call this a spell build without using any actual charms. So what we're going to do now is go through each spell charm and see how it affects the numbers, going from the lowest DPS and working our way up to the highest DPS build. The first of these charms is going to be Dream Wielder. This will speed up our Dream Nail animation as well as double the amount of soul it gives to 66. Now, don't get me wrong, in a real world scenario, Dream Wielder is pretty amazing, especially for only 1 notch, but in terms of paper DPS, it surprisingly falls a bit short. I think mainly because it contributes no damage by itself and gets no benefit from animation cancelling with spells. Oh, and it also takes a pretty hefty 1.1 seconds to use, even with this charm equipped. The rotation looks a bit different with this charm as we aren't using nail strikes. Instead, we're dream nailing once for 66 soul soul, then double casting a spell, and rinsing and repeating. Up next, we have Soul Catcher. This will give us an extra 3 soul per hit, for a total of 14. If you're one of the few people who have watched my charm tier list, you'll know I'm not really a big fan of this charm, but it does still give us a nice little bump in DPS to this spell weaving build. But it does let us cast one swing quicker just about every other cast. Spell Twister is up next. This performs ever so slightly better than Soul Catcher for the same 2-notch cost. The reduced spell cost of 24 soul will mean most of the time you'll be swinging twice, then casting, with 3 hits required every so often. Of course, with the benefit of being able to save up 4 spells in a real combat scenario if needed. Up next, we have everyone's favourite spell charm, and that charm is of course Shaman Stone. For 3 notches, this will directly boost spell damage by 33 to 51% depending on the spell. Surprisingly, this on its own doesn't deal much more DPS than the previous 2 charms when looking at Shade Soul and the Fluke Nest spells. However, looking at Abyss Shriek, which receives the highest damage increase of 50%, clearly pulls ahead by quite a large margin. Quick Slash is up next. This is going to increase our nail attack speed by 46%. Now, this toes the line of what I'd consider a spell-related charm, but faster hits means faster soul generation, means more spells, so I thought I better at least mention it. This attack pattern looks identical to the base, except our nail slashes are, as you guessed it, quicker. Either way you slice it, this charm outperforms the previous charms, at least on paper, by a decent margin. But of course you'll be lacking the burst Shaman Stone provides in a real world scenario. Getting back to more traditional spell charms, we have Soul Eater. For 4 notches, we'll be getting 19 soul per hit, which is pretty insane. This thing does some work. Taking a look at the loop, you'll notice for the most part we can cast the spell every 2 nail hits. And even better than that, 26% of the time, we're able to cast in a single hit, making great use of spell animation cancels. But how does this fare against the combined might of Spell Twister and Soul Catcher that also cost a combined 4 notches? Well, it's really close actually, but this 2-charm combo pulls ahead just a little bit. Every spell can be cast at most within 2 strikes. However, an even higher percent of the time we can now cast within a single strike, 28%, or every 2 out of 7 casts in fact. But now for the ultimate setup. Let's throw on Soul Catcher, Spell Twister, Shaman Stone, and Soul Eater. How are we looking now? Naturally, this skyrockets our DPS by quite a huge amount. 10 out of every 11 casts, or 90%, now only require a single strike, making the absolute most out of our animation cancels. So much so that it's not far off the DPS of if we could just infinitely spam spells back to back. With Shade Soul, we're getting to 117.56 DPS. With Descending Dark, we're getting to 100.69 DPS if all parts hit. With Abyss Shriek, the strongest of the base spells, we're hitting for 187.62 DPS. Though it would be pretty tough to consistently land this and nail strikes at the same time due to the damage being dealt above the knight. And finally, although you'd have to overcharm to fit this on, with Fluke Nest you'd be getting to 179.44 DPS. Just a fraction lower than Abyss Shriek, but much more reasonable to hit. And if you can manage to get the double hit bug of Flukes to work, this could even surpass Shriek's numbers. Interestingly enough, both Descending Dark and Shade Soul in this setup exceed the DPS of just purely spamming spells back to back, and that's purely due to the crazy DPS of the animation cancelled nail strikes. So why is Quick Slash absent from this build, despite it performing so well when we tested it solo? Well, since 90% of our strikes are now animation cancelled by spells, it means Quick Slash really doesn't have much impact and gets outperformed by every other charm. Again, at least on paper. Now I will mention that if you want to save some notches, taking off Soul Catcher can get you most of the way here anyway. You'll only lose around 7% of your DPS, which is probably worth it for some extra comfort. So now to answer my earlier question, how does this compare to a nail focus build? Well, if you've watched my previous video about nail DPS, check it out if you haven't already, then you'll know for the base game our highest possible nail based build did just over 199 DPS. However, it did have a few spare slots for utility, which could be used for more damage via summons. If we're using these figures, nail builds are the clear winner. The damage is easier to land, it has slightly higher output, and it has a few free notches to play with. And this isn't really all that surprising. Similar to nail arts, and yes, I have a video on that one as well, spells are more about burst damage, as well as range and hitting multiple targets, which is extremely valuable in the right circumstances. And this value isn't really reflected on paper. Yes, I could calculate the DPS if you're hitting multiple targets, but let's be honest here, the only time you really care about maximizing your damage is against bosses, so there wouldn't really be much point. But spell builds haven't quite lost yet. One thing we could do to even the playing field is exclude Fury of the Fallen from the Nail build. If we're being honest, only a small percent of us can actually make use of this charm, so it's sort of unfair to include it in the comparison. If we now compare the two builds, it flips on its head. A Nail setup without Fury of the Fallen would now be hitting for a maximum theoretical damage of 114 DPS. Far lower than most of the spell setups, although with the trade-off of now having 5 spare notches to play with, which maybe I'll make a video on about hybrid builds in the future. But stick around because we're not quite done yet. You probably know by now I love to include the fan-made DLC Pale Court in these videos. Pale Court has a charm called Boon of Hallownest that upgrades spells to their pure versions. These spells are harder to land generally, but even further increase their damage at the cost of 4 notches. So how do these impact things? We're not going to go quite as in-depth as the base game spells, otherwise we'd be here all day. But let's see how much it does on its own, as well as the highest possible DPS setup. For Boon of Hallownest alone, we can see it's already the largest single charm increase by quite a large margin. Comparing a Shaman Stone Empowered Abyss Shriek, which was hitting 119 DPS, Boon blows it out of the water and hits for a whopping 132 DPS. And it's a similar story for Shade Soul. With Shaman Stone, we were hitting for 76 DPS, and now with Boon, we're hitting for 102 DPS. So now, what's the ultimate spell build including Pale Court charms? Well, we'll be using Shaman Stone, Spell Twister, Soul Eater, and Overcharming with Boon of Hallownest. With this combination, we'll be doing huge damage. 195.05 DPS with Shade Soul, which is now Pure Daggers, 134.17 DPS with Descending Dark, which is now Pure Pillars, and finally, a monstrous 247.72 DPS with Abyss Shriek, which is now Pure Blasts. And if you don't feel comfortable overcharming, then you'll want to drop Soul Eater in favor of Soul Catcher, which will only lower your DPS by around 7 to 15% depending on the spell. But how does this compare to the Pale Court best nail builds? Well, I'll let you find that out by yourself by checking out the nail DPS video on screen now. Thanks for watching guys, consider liking and commenting if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.